I want to start with a story, and I loved listening to Marianne talk about art. We share that sometime in the mid-70s, we took a road trip. You, I take it, came from the Midwest, more or less. I came from Texas. But we went to this place called San Francisco. And it was a place that was in the middle of several revolutions. A revolution of identity that was post-colonial. A revolution of culture making that was post-industrial. It involved all sorts of different changes and all sorts of different possibilities. The one I seemed to be very interested in from the very beginning was a revolution in storytelling. I felt that the culture of the 20th century had done something very similar to what it had done to our forests around our stories. It had removed our ability to tell our own stories, to own our own stories in different ways. And I became interested in this not as a political activist, which was one of my hats, but as a contemporary theater artist and someone interested in the way that voice could be created through new mechanisms of artistic engagement. By 1993, having run a theater and belonged to networks very similar to the ones that Marianne were part of, I became very interested in the role of technology. And the idea was to look at the way that story in the machine, in the screen, could be claimed as a reconstitution of story as a universal literacy by teaching people to make film. Or put another way, if the 20th century took away our stories because of the screen, the 21st century would give us back our stories because of the screen. And so I'd like to tell the story of a journey into that work and talk about this spring and some of the examples of how far we've gone in the 18 years I've been doing this process. It starts with the idea for us that while we work on stories, often to understand a great deal about the world and the way we describe ideas, that internally what our process is trying to discover something new about ourselves. This is the gift that all artists have, is a way to use the material of their lived experience to claim some new knowledge, not just about the way they see the world, but the way they understand themselves. For us, we took this idea of how to make stories through the mechanism of lived experience, and walked ourselves through a process that would allow us to essentially sink into life experience through processes of listening and sharing stories in groups and creating ways to trigger memory and trigger voice into a style of media making that was very, very simple. The approach had us focused in 4 areas, and I called it here story mining because in a way it was about digging out what was inherent, what was already there, what could be remembered in our way of telling stories. And it started with taking this artistic approach, expressing what are the core elements that we understand about story. So it was making visible, if you will, an aesthetic parameter that everyone could understand. And these were elements of story and of making a media that could be simplified enough that really it didn't matter what your educational background was. You could sort of remember, oh yeah, that's why when I see a wonderful story, it strikes me. I can hold it in my heart. Then we used this process that I described called a story circle, which was a new way to facilitate group interchange that was part therapy and part kind of consciousness raising and part artistic process, moving people from big ideas about stories to little ideas about stories. And the third thing that we worked on was methods of teaching media on a computer that didn't emphasize the depth of the computer, but the simplicity in which these tools could be worked with. We were very close to the world of the new digital media revolution in the Bay Area. Many of the companies that invented the tools for playing with photography or working with video or the machines themselves were based in the area. And so we had a direct collaboration for them to think about more essential ways of designing tools to allow large numbers of people to make art, or in this case, make short videos. And finally, we built a structure in which every single one of our processes ends up where every single person completes a story, completes a movie, if you will. And for us, this was a critical commitment, that part of the literacy process meant that everyone had to have agency in knowing that their story would be presented. They could choose not to present it, but they knew it was possible. I'll show one brief story just to give you an idea of what these things look like and to have you hear the voice of a storyteller in one of the many workshops that we do, in this case related to healthcare.
One Sunday morning, I bought the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the local newspaper. I was on my way to visit my mother. Having all that reading would be a good way to avoid listening to her. I endured her rants and rages for a lifetime. She was best at aiming them toward my dad. I hated being there. She kept talking as I read the paper. I couldn't wait to leave. I've listened to so many stories of women living with despair. It's what I do. And inevitably, I think about my mom. Like Mona. Mona was first sexually molested by her grandfather as a girl, and then her sister's husband as a teenager. She married to get away and got abused and beat up by several partners. She lost two men she truly loved by tragic, untimely deaths. One who she finally stood up to and said no more. And here's the thing. She helped him get clean and sober. And then she lives with unrelenting depression for years while caring for a brain-damaged granddaughter who finally dies. And Mona wants to help other women. And Mona is strong and powerful and still loves people and believes in the power of hope and friendship and caring. There's this beauty there. Like somehow, some way, all that despair, all that pain, all that suffering is placed in some larger context that makes you appreciate their being here, their existence. My sister called me to say Mom was in the hospital with pneumonia. I drove alone silently for 3 hours and walked into her room without any newspapers. I was in the hospital with her that last week, all alone. She was so different, so tiny and thin and confused. I've been thinking for a while since these women came into my life, like Mona, that maybe my mom has some story like theirs, but I just don't know it. And maybe her anger is like their despair. I didn't ask, but I put lotion on my hands and said, Mom, I'm going to give you a back rub. I warmed the lotion and my hands, rubbing them together, and started gently stroking her back, starting at the base of her spine, moving up, fanning out over her shoulders, and then down each side of her back, slowly, again and again. I could feel her bones, and she sighed deeply, saying softly, "Oh, I love that." And there was this beauty I had never seen before.
Our work has taken us around the world. We've become very interested in the use of our tool as a mechanism of a different kind of approach to social change. So it was with a great deal of pride that we heard activists in Tunisia and Egypt and Syria and Yemen and other parts of the Middle East describe some of what they were doing was digital storytelling. The spring uprisings in all these countries that has changed the political landscape of the contemporary Middle East forever came at the somewhat expedition of the use of social media. And the stories that came out of those environments were often stories not about vast ideas about how change would manifest itself, a revolutionary program purely, but about the cornerstone of the idea that there were individuals, often young individuals, who just did not see their lives being played out fully. The story of their lives and the story of their creative possibility was less than they liked. As they took to the streets, one of the things they did is document endlessly not only what was going on in terms of the demonstrations, but also what was the stories behind the stories. Who were these individuals? What stories did they have to tell? Some of you may know Slim Amanou. He was a Tunisian blogger who was one of the people who was at the front of the Tunisian uprising that was the first spark in this pan-Arab change, who had a blog called No Memory Space. And he was able to essentially, through his individual interests, which were about the same as any young person in kind of hip YouTube videos and new music and all these things, to turn that into a dialogue. He ended up being asked at the beginning of the change to be the Minister of Youth and Sports, which his job started in January as a result of this work. I think he would be proud to say that his resignation on May 25th, because of censorship by the current government of Tunisia, reflects also the changes that will come. But a lot of us have come to understand this idea that the cult of the individual is running into the cult of the social network, of the close network. And someplace between these two, we're creating, manifesting a new way of using these networks in an effective way. The activist Rim Noor has talked a lot about the fact that this was not the reason that these changes happened. These changes would have happened. But they did a number of things to expedite those changes. And they allowed, particularly in these areas, grassroots mobilization, active citizenship by reporting on what was happening on the streets. They were able to counter rumors and counter propaganda by the government and government media. And they helped people to analyze government statements by immediately responding to those statements in real time with the facts on the ground. It changed many things very quickly. And for us as storytellers, this idea that these machines, there are 4 billion cell phones in the world. 2 billion of them have the ability to capture photographs or media of some sort. These machines are changing all sorts of dynamics almost instantaneously, whether they're in the open source environment, the Droid world, or not. They're changing our ability to capture material and immediately respond to situations in a way that those revolutionaries of the 1970s, we dreamed of this possibility. It's happening so fast that it's virtually instantaneous. At the same time, we've seen the ability to make change in the face of disaster in whole new ways. I was able to do a lot of work in Japan in the past, and when the earthquake happened on 3/11, there were a number of us that were engaged in activities to help with fundraising and doing development work, connecting with organizations on the ground through these kinds of networks, through our Facebook friends, through all sorts of things, to invent new ways to raise money and connect with each other. We did artistic programs that would allow people to do art to raise money. There were programs like the Living Social Match, which was able in 24 hours to raise $2 million in the most kind of amazing instant fundraising campaign There were individuals like this one who put up a poster that says, "Go to a party dressed sluttily. When a boy asks you for your number, grab his phone and then punch in the code for him to give $10 to the Japanese." It was a brilliant solution. But you found throughout the internet thousands and thousands of videos documenting the earthquake and giving connections to different people in different contexts. And it was an important part of the storytelling process that we think in both the case of the Arab Spring and in the case of this disaster response network that is happening at the grassroots level, is changing the story about where the center is. And when the story of where the center of media is, and I'm saying this to you who live in the land of Berlusconi, or Burlesque-Goni, I think he's called now, that when we change the center of that, we can actually change the dynamics of power. You know, there's a wonderful writer named Naomi Klein, who's a Canadian, wrote a book called Shock Doctrine, the Shock Doctrine, that's about the way governments use events like L'Aquila or the economic crisis in Greece, or to grab hold of the situation, make changes while people are sort of stunned, and then implement what their version of a democratic decision is, which is actually to take us back many centuries. In the United States, this feeling that the shock doctrine is leading to a backward thinking in some of the political party and the Republicans' perspective is extraordinary. It's almost like thinking has stopped in the face of everybody's fear. But these processes of owning your own story, of telling your story in a way that matters through the mechanism of new media, is a way to counter that and move the center from those controlling voices of the mass media down to almost the individual level, where it can make a real difference. The quality of stories still have to come down to this concept. Our wonderful poet, Maya Angelou, has said this, that it doesn't really matter what you do, it doesn't really matter what you say. It matters how you make people feel. And for us, this is the role of the arts, is to take our hearts and make them available to the world. Without that, no matter how well we try to think through these problems as economists and sociologists and experts in the way we manage the world, if we are not open to change, then change can't happen. And to me, that starts here, not here. And with that, I thank you.